I'm going to talk tonight about 3 projects so that I can go into a little bit of detail, and I'm going to talk about them with a particular focus on 3 issues: placemaking, innovation and craftsmanship, because I think those 3 issues are some of the most important for architects today. So this is my office, ALA, and everybody has to take their shoes off. It's obligatory. And it kind of says something about us. It speaks about this pile of messy shoes. It speaks about each of us as an individual, but there's something about, it also speaks about common endeavor and that we're all in this together. And there's something about when you take your shoes off, it's a great leveler, it makes things a little bit more informal, but also I think you leave behind some of your preoccupations and your baggage, and you're fresh to start. So that's who we are. And I think for clients it's quite interesting because they're not obliged to take their shoes off, but they're encouraged to take their shoes off. And when they see this pile of shoes, and it's like a kind of subliminal message that you are not in for a passive ride. You're part of the team. We're all in it together. And collaboration is so important in architecture. So I think that subliminal message maybe is a little bit helpful. So the first project I'm going to talk about is MPavilion, which is a pavilion that we completed just over a year ago. And it's very much based on the Serpentine Commission, which has now become extremely well known for its commissions from across the world. And the site of this MPavilion is in a really fabulous park in Melbourne. And it's quite difficult, I think, when you're designing a very small structure in a very large open space, how to know what to respond to. There's very little context, in a sense. And so we wanted the design of this pavilion to really come from the park, from the trees. And so we designed it as a series of petals, interlocking, connected petals that would let the light in, that would at times let the rain in at the edge, and that it would be incredibly delicate because we want this pavilion to sway in the wind. And the columns that support the pavilion are only 35 millimeters in diameter. And so when there is a wind, the whole structure sways. And it's quite, what's nice about a pavilion is you're not constrained by the usual constraints of buildings. And so the idea that you can design something that will respond to the climate became very important to us. So this is the first render that we did, and we'd imagined this series of interlocking petals and very slender columns, and that the petals themselves would be translucent, but they would also let light in between them around the edges. And we had a hunch of how to make this, but we'd never done anything quite like this before. And I was very lucky that when I went for my first meeting, I was introduced by Arup, who we work with, the engineers we work with a lot in London, but also have an office in Melbourne. They introduced me to a specialist boat builder, started in the boat building industry, who work specifically with composites. And we had a telephone conversation, because actually they're not based in Melbourne, they're based in Brisbane, about whether they were up for experimenting and exploring if we could create these incredibly fragile, slender petals that would let light in, but that would be stiff enough. And they were remarkable collaborators. And the solution that we came up with really was a collaboration. We could not have done it without them. So the idea was to create to use a translucent resin and then to put into that translucent resin carbon fiber strands that would stiffen it. And what was so extraordinary is when they started to experiment, it was because nothing had been done like this before, where you're using strands both as a decorative but also a structural material, to find the right degree of set of the resin. Because if you let it set too hard, the carbon fibers would just sink to the bottom. And if it was too soft, they would just float. And they, through a series of experiments, they realized that the only way to do this was to do it as a continuous process. So they had a 24-hour operation, and they worked in shifts. And it's so, to do something that pushes the boundaries, you need everybody to participate and to be as enthusiastic and as curious as you are. And so the makers of our buildings are as important as the engineers, as the client and everyone else. So you can see how it's quite a kind of hand process. And then the carbon fiber ribs that connect the petals were actually vacuum formed. And there you can see a completed petal. These petals, the large ones, span 5 meters, and they are only 3 millimeters thick. And this is the pavilion completed. So you can see the analogy with the tree and the leaves of a tree. And it became a place to meet. And it was there for 4 months, and it had a whole program of cultural events. And the kind of response to the location and the landscape. So you see the light that comes through the edge, and therefore the extent of the building, if you like, goes beyond its boundaries. And it became a place where people just hung out, and you had spontaneous yoga classes. And it was an extremely Instagrammed moment, and Gilbert and George came and had a beer there. And this is the edge of the pavilion, where we deliberately allow the sunlight in and the water in at the edge, and the relationship to the city, so that there's this very fragile structure with the city behind. And all of the lighting was integrated into the design, so the electrics went up the columns, which were hollow, and then we had LEDs which could be tuned up and down. And this is just a little video. They put a drone. It just gives you this very different reading from wherever you see it. And you could have the lights just as little spots, or you could make the petals glow. And it's one of those images that actually is exactly what we drew on the plan. So the next project is a very different scale. Some of you, I think, have been there. MAT, the Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology. This is the first cultural project that we have completed. It's in Lisbon. It's on a wonderful site. It's on the River Tagus. It's the very southern point of Europe. The light is absolutely beautiful, and it faces south. And it's next to the old power station, which is a really important part of Lisbon's industrial heritage. And this is a photograph that was taken on the opening day. And what you can see, what looks like a kind of hairy top is actually people. And on the opening day, there were 80,000 people who came to visit the building, either to go inside it or to go onto the roof or to be on the steps. And this is from a city that has a population of less than 1 million people. And what was so important for us when we began imagining this project was that it's not just a cultural project, it's also an urban project. And I think this is a responsibility that we all have to go beyond architecture and to make sure that the building contributes to the city as well as for the people who are going to use the building. So we actually created more public space in this building than cultural space. There's 9,500 square meters of public outdoor space on the roof, on the steps, and going down in front of the river, and then about 7,500 square meters of building. And it was on the opening day. There were so many people that came to see the building that they had to close this bridge because it was in danger of collapse. And thank goodness we hadn't designed that. We actually have designed the bridge, but it's not completed yet. So to put it into context, this is an aerial view. The pink line is the sweep of the bridge that we have designed. It spans 60 meters. One of the extraordinary things about this site, although it's wonderful and it's on the river in Lisbon is completely cut off from the old city and the rest of the city because of the railway tracks that were built at the end of the 19th century. And for a long time, the riverfront has been without any animation, without any activity. And this building, in a sense, consolidates a citywide initiative to regenerate the riverfront. There's been a lot of money invested in it, and this is perhaps the kind of the finale because it is a destination in its own right. Because it's next to the power station, there is a substation that actually sits below our building, and our building kind of sweeps around it. And that had to be moved, and that formed part of our project. And that power station actually powers the presidential palace, so it's quite critical that it functioned at all times. And you can see how, with the sweep of the bridge and the kind of the gentle curve of the embrace of the substation, how the form of the building kind of emerged out of the constraints of the site, but also the movement along the site. So what you're seeing here is the roof, and the bridge connects to the roof, and as it goes over the railway tracks, it lands in a newly landscaped square. But there will be no steps. Because of the height differential, you'll be at grade. So it's completely accessible in a city that is actually very difficult for people who are disabled or people, with buggies. It's extremely, there's 7 hills, and it was important for us that this was a very accessible building. This is the photograph of the roof. The brown will eventually be grass, but it's just newly planted. And the steps are facing down towards the city, so that when you're on the roof, you can not only have views over the river, which are fabulous, but you can also look back to the city, which is a perspective that has never been open to people before, because you couldn't get high enough. But we wanted the building to be very low in order that from the river you could still see the old city, and in the old city you could still see the river. And this was an early montage we did, but in proposing that during the summer months they will install a screen and show movies with the backdrop of the city. So you have both a physical link to the city, but also a metaphorical link to the city. And it's become, even though it's only been opened a couple of months, it really has become a destination. So it's a place just to go to hang out, as well as to go and see culture. And this is the wonderful view that you have from the roof, looking back towards the city. And the relationship with the old power station is important, because that power station is part of the wider art campus. And our client, EDP, who are the biggest energy providers in Portugal, they have a foundation. And this building and the whole campus, the whole art campus, is about a privately owned utility company, actually majority owned by the Chinese now, giving back to the city. And I think it's a wonderful example of a piece of patronage, if you like, from a privately owned company, because cultural buildings are increasingly funded by private money because there is not the public money to go around. And this is on the roof, looking over the river. And at different times of day, it has a completely different reading. So the previous slide was at dawn. This is at dusk. This is the view from the river. As you walk or run or promenade along the riverfront, your view again is very different. And at night, an altogether different reading. The skin of the building is many thousands of bespoke ceramic tiles. And we worked very hard with Kumela, who are based in just outside Barcelona, and they do they're a wonderful family business, and they've done all the restoration of the Gaudi buildings. We did actually look to use ceramic companies in Portugal who could certainly have done it, but what they couldn't have done was fix the tiles, and it was absolutely vital that whoever made the tiles was responsible for fixing them too. So the tiles that we spent a long time designing and researching the quality of the glaze and the shape of the tiles so that it would very gently turn these corners, and that at a certain point in the curvature the tiles meet and form a hexagon, and in other parts of the building they're offset. And they're slightly three-dimensional, so you get this very complex reading. That the ceramic factory was, for months and months, given over to creating these, each tile by hand, a very artisanal process. And we spent a long time looking and working with Kumela to look at the kind of glaze that would, because the site is so spectacular and the light is so beautiful, we wanted the tiles and the skin of the building to just amplify the changing light conditions that you get. And so we put a sparkle into the tile. And really there are times it looks silver, times it looks black, and times it looks gold. And then we put a crackle glaze, because when you get up close to the tiles, there's a kind of richness and a depth, and it's a reference to the ancient crackle glaze, Chinese crackle glaze, which was actually discovered through an accident in the kiln. This is a close-up showing that, if you look at a certain angle, your reading, your perception of the skin is very different. And because of the three-dimensionality of the tiles, the edges pick up more light, and so you get this kind of complex reading. And this is what happens at dusk. It's sort of silvery black. And this is what happens at sunset. So they have the most phenomenal sunsets, and the whole building becomes golden, and the river becomes gold. It's a really magic moment in the day. And because we wanted to really use the context of this site to drive the building, we wanted to do it in a very literal way as well. So when the sun hits the water, it bounces off. It hits the underside of the cantilever, and the cantilever we did for two reasons. One, to create some very welcome shade along the riverfront, because there is no shade at all, and Lisbon has the most fabulous climate from March to November. But also that we could use the underside of the cantilever, that is also tiled, to then bounce the light down through a roof light into the gallery space below, so that at a certain time of day, at a certain time of year, you will have a literal trace of the pattern of the water on the floor. This was during construction, and it's not, it doesn't happen every day, but when you get this moment of incredible sunlight that is let into a gallery, it's quite an unusual thing to let so much sunlight into a gallery space. You can, of course, use blinds to cut it off. And this is in the summer months. The the roof light is designed so that during the summer months you only get indirect light because the sunlight would be far too powerful and too hot. But when you look up through that roof light, you see the tiles, you see the people, you see the sky. You have a really clear understanding of where you are. This is an in-construction shot of the Oval Gallery, the principal space of the museum. When you come into the museum, rather counterintuitively, you walk down. And the reason for this was so that we could keep the building really low slung in relation to its neighbour, the power station, and also so that you have this, you can land on the roof and the roof becomes a part of the city. This is the first installation by a French artist, Dominique Gonzalez-Forster, who did a very site-specific piece. In fact, every exhibition, every installation here will be site-specific, and to some degree it will be a response to architecture, because this is a museum there is no collection. It's about the convergence of art, architecture, and technology, and to try and create a discourse about the connections and the differences between the three disciplines. And because of that, we wanted all the spaces to flow into each other. So the public realm, if you like, becomes the gallery space, and each space flows into the other. This is a room designed specifically for triple video projections. And this is a space that they call the project room, which will be used to showcase young Portuguese talent. And again, a very Instagrammed building. And then the last project I'm going to talk about is the work that we've been doing for the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. We've been working on this for 5.5 years. It's a competition that we won in 2011. And the big event of this project is the gallery space, but the gallery space is below ground. And that very kind of, the paradox of doing the biggest project, the biggest project the V&A have ever done in 100 years, the paradox of it being invisible is actually what drove the thinking of our project. Because we reflected on that before we'd even started designing. And we came up with the phrase, making visible the invisible. And it's a very abstract notion, but it's a notion that has driven our thinking at a micro scale, but also the macro scale. So that's just an image of a render of the gallery. So to come back to where it is, it's in London, it's between South Kensington Tube Station and Hyde Park. And Exhibition Road has now been semi-pedestrianised. So it's a street where really people just take time to wander. And it's full of museums, Imperial College, and it was the route to the great exhibition in Hyde Park and Crystal Palace, so it has huge kind of history. And what we wanted to do, being really quite inspired by this newly pedestrianised street, which is becoming more and more common in cities because it's so much nicer to walk without cars, was could we try and renegotiate the relationship between the museum and the street. And so what we did was to take the street into the museum and take the museum out onto the street. And we did this by creating a courtyard, but 2 levels of courtyard, because the level of Exhibition Road is 2 meters above the level of the entrance to the V&A. So we had to negotiate that level difference. So we create a maximum area of high courtyard, which then flows into an area of low courtyard. And this courtyard is a new public place in London. It's interesting because this site, originally Daniel Libeskind won the competition and got planning permission for a building on this site. Fortunately, it didn't happen for me. And what was so interesting, it was a 5-6-story building. It was quite bombastic. And all the spaces inside were at the service of the architecture, if you like. Anyway, for one reason or another, it didn't happen. And I think that moment, in London at least, for me, marked the end of the building as icon. And what I became more interested in was the iconography of place. And that's very much what this courtyard is about. So it's a place for installations, it can be curated, you can see it as an outdoor gallery, it's a place for parties, but more than anything, it's a place for appropriation by the public. And for me, the success of this project will not be just the gallery, it will be when this courtyard becomes a destination and a place in its own right, where people just go to meet and hang out and have an assignation. But in order to create this courtyard, we had to deal with history. And this is the Aston Webb screen. Aston Webb designed much of the V&A. And it presented a very formidable and opaque facade to the street. And even at competition stage, we intuitively understood that the key to unlocking the potential of this site would be to open up this screen. But as you in Italy know better than we do, when you have a Grade 1 listed building, which is the highest level of kind of heritage protection, the presumption is you do not mess with it. But it's maybe the right presumption, but you must be daring enough to challenge it. Because if we'd left the screen as it was, there's no way that the courtyard would have the same resonance. And we argued, when we first presented the scheme to English Heritage, and you must have your equivalent, they simply said no. And we went away, we didn't change the design, but what we did do was change the way we argued the case. So when I first went, it was just presenting it, say, this is a brilliant idea, this is how it is. So what we did, we worked with 2 researchers from the V&A, and we unearthed more drawings and began to understand more about the history and the heritage than English Heritage themselves understood. And we found a drawing that Aston Webb had done at competition stage for this project. And when he won the competition, it was not for a screen like this. The screen was very low, it was a balustrade, it was still solid, up to about a metre, maybe a bit more. But behind that, there was a garden. And the only reason it changed was they ran out of money, same old, happens every project, and the boiler rooms that were meant to be below ground had to be above ground because there was no money to put them below ground. So he changed the design at a very late stage to hide the boiler rooms, and that is why it's solid. And when we found that drawing, I knew that we had won the argument. So we went back to English Heritage and said that, the screen was originally designed to hide, the boiler rooms have long since gone, and now its purpose must be altered because it's about revealing, not hiding. And by opening up the screen, you suddenly reveal these extraordinary elevations of the V&A that nobody has really noticed much before, because the street is not really wide enough to have a proper perspective. And this is the competition render that we did. So we placed the cafe in the area of sun on the left-hand side, So the idea is you can just drift into the courtyard. There is no, the kind of threshold moment is very extended. There's no front door, there's no, big entrance. You just drift in off the street. And when you're in the courtyard, we've designed it in a way so you, almost as though it's a kind of outdoor lobby, because you can begin to have an intuitive understanding of the complexity of the museum. So you can see straight through the new entrance that we've created, through to the Majeski Gardens, which are behind. You can, if you look to the right, you can see through to the Hintsey Galleries. And to the left, you'll be able to see this incredible sgraffito wall that's just been cleaned and never been seen by the public. So you do have this very intuitive sense of where you are in relation to the museum. And then we also designed an oculus that would look down into the void of the gallery space below, because going back to this notion of making visible the invisible, that was one of the more literal ways of understanding that the big event is below ground. And this is a view at night. So the oculus is actually now a lot more beautiful than this. This was the competition. But between the voids in the structure, you see down to the gallery below. And we've conceptualized this oculus as though it were an empty museum vitrine, because what you're seeing is the structure that supports the courtyard, which is the ceiling of the gallery below. And we, on the stainless steel balustrade, which doesn't read like a balustrade, it's something much more sculptural, on the inside where people don't touch it, it's highly polished. So it reflects back to you the structure and gives you a very kind of didactic reading of the project. And then we've painted the inside of the structure this very deep red as a kind of reference to the red velvet of old museum vitrines. And this is the outside face of the oculus, so you see it's much more refined than that rather crude angular one. It has much softer edges. It looks a bit like a TGV. And this was made in Holland by some extraordinary steel makers there, and has been delivered in 3 pieces. Then we had to make a new entrance into the museum itself. And so it was very important to us to make a legible distinction between what is old and what is new. So where we had to create a new entrance, we literally just sliced through the stone. But what's so interesting, in slicing through the stone, you reveal something that you haven't seen before. You reveal this incredible profile, which is the fenestration of the other windows, but you're seeing it in a different way. So sometimes absence, by taking something away, you can show more. And this is the reality. So it is literally like we drew in the competition stage. You see this very elegant profile of the stonework, in my view, much more elegant than the fenestration further along. And then the doors, the frame of the new entrance door is inscribed into the stone. And then when you've come into the museum, into the new entrance hall, there are 2 stairs. There's one to go down and one to go up, and there are 2 reasons for that. It's partly to deal with the volume of visitors, because this space is going to be for all the temporary shows, all the blockbuster shows like the Bowie, the Alexander McQueen, and the Pink Floyd show. But it's also about I'm a bit of a purist, and my biggest critique of the V&A is at the moment, and it will still happen after this project, but you enter the museum through the shop. And I understand that the shop is a very important part of a museum's revenue. I totally understand. But I feel it's a little crass to enter a museum through the shop. So by having 2 stairs, you exit through the shop. So you're obliged to buy a book on your way out. But it's your reward after you've had your cultural visit. And what you can see here is this kind of, now we're inside the main museum, but this interweaving of history and modernity. And we wanted to, because when you go down, we've gone down a long way. When you go down into a space, it can be very disorientating. And so we've made sure that there are always views that we've created with roof lights, so that as you go down or as you're coming up, you see a different part of the museum. You understand where you are, so it's less disorientating. And that is the reality of the view. It's much more complete now, but it's a very kind of a literal reading of what we've done. And then the ceiling itself and the structure, most people in the competition had, because that was the brief from the V&A, created a white box or a black box. And our take was that, first of all, that's just not the V&A. The V&A has this very rich history of neoclassic, neo-Gothic, decorative ceilings. And the V&A is a very didactic building. Its mission is didactic. Its collection is didactic. Everything is didactic about it. Its ethos. And we wanted to reflect that. So, and this again is a competition drawing, but we wanted to design a ceiling that reflected its sense of purpose, structural purpose. So this ceiling structure is in a sense purely a kind of response to the structural challenge, which was to span 38 meters. And it's a folded steel plate, but it's a very complex ceiling and a complex geometry. And this is the, during construction, again, it's a little more complete, but you can see that this ceiling does more than just span 38 meters. It has all the AC, it has all the lighting, it has all the paraphernalia to do with audio-visual. You can hang a car or an aeroplane from the ceiling. It's working very hard. You'll see that it's gone grey, and the V&A love grey, and we love the V&A, so it's grey. And here's a slightly more focused shot where you can see that because of this complex geometry, you get a very nice reading of the form, although the lights for most exhibitions will be from above looking down. And then you've been to the show, and you're coming up the staircase to go out. And actually that's Obama going up the stairs. It's like he's gone now, and we're going to miss him. In the balustrade of the stairs, which are very glossy, they're a very kind of highly polished lacquer, you can see, because of the views that we've set up, that you get a reflection of the Henry Cole wing in the balustrade itself. So there's always this sort of interrelationship between old and new. And then as you come up the stairs and you enter the shop, you come into this very lofty, light-filled space. And there you can see, for the first time, what will be revealed, this newly clean sgraffito wall. Now, this idea of making visible the invisible, it was very important to us that the surface of the courtyard, that first of all, that the courtyard has a very particular character. It's not just York paving or granite sets, that it has something that speaks of the mission and the ethos of the V&A. But we wanted it also to speak of something else. We wanted it to speak of the structure that supported it. And so on the left, you have the structure, and on the right, you have the passages between. So as the structure deepens, the pattern compresses, and as the structure is more shallow, the pattern opens out. And so from manipulating a three-dimensional surface into a two-dimensional plane, we get this very visually complex pattern, which is derived from the structure, but it's quite abstract. So it reads, we wanted it to read as a color field, that you didn't really read the big joints, and therefore all of the tiles, they're not, they're parallelograms rather than completely orthogonal. And this is the drawing that we did for the poor guys who've got to lay the tiles. So there are only 6 tile types, but they're all mixed up, and they all have their place. And then they're all with one colour, except they're just a couple that are red and a couple that are yellow that are randomly placed. It's a bit of fun. The colour of the glazing on these tiles, we were very inspired by the ceramic collection at the V&A, which is one of the most important in the world. And I've had a personal tour several times from the keeper of ceramics, and to be taken round a gallery and be spoken to by someone who knows more about the subject than anyone in the world is a really very humbling experience. And these beautiful Chinese glazes that are the Celadon, very kind of pale bluey green, and when the glaze falls to the bottom, the colour is more intense, it's kind of pooling, and we wanted to somehow recreate that. Although we've got, we know that we have to have a courtyard that is a volume produced because it's massive, but we wanted it to be a kind of merging of artisanal and volume production, because again that speaks very much of the V&A's ethos of marrying arts and crafts with industry, which is where they started. So we did 2.5 years research into ceramics and porcelain. We didn't hold up the project for this. It's really important. We had that latitude because of the phasing of the program. But we didn't, at the beginning, we didn't know what would be the solution. We didn't know how we were going to get there. We knew what we wanted, but we didn't know, rather like with Melbourne, we didn't know how to get there. And it took research and working with various makers and manufacturers. And while we were doing that research, we came across Tishela, who are the oldest manufacturing company in the Netherlands. And they're a family-run business. And they work with porcelain on faience, for elevations. And we saw this porcelain clay, which was so much more beautiful than the kind of biscuity ceramic clays that you get, which are a little bit kind of rough, a little bit brownish. And the porcelain-based clay is this sort of very kind of nuanced grey, a little bit with a little bit of blue, white. It's very, very fine. It has a finesse that ceramics don't. And we fell in love with this material, but it had never been used in a public place before. And yet porcelain is one of the hardest materials. It is harder than stone, it is harder than granite. And it's completely vitreous, so there's no problem with frost, but what there was an issue was non-slip, because nobody had used it before. So we had to work with Tishela, they did most of the work, in finding what was the additive that would give the friction to allow us to use this as a surface in a public space. And of course it went through a huge amount of EU testing in order to verify its properties. And again, this factory in the Netherlands, just outside Rotterdam, was devoted, and there are hundreds of thousands of these tiles. And they're slip cast, so it's a very artisanal process, and they are not rectified after they've been poured, because we wanted to reflect that, the handmade, that feeling in the design. So this is a parallelogram. You can see the mold. And to make matters more complicated, we wanted to use a glaze. We wanted to introduce colour into the courtyard because it has such important messaging. But we know that a glossy glaze is very slippery, so we cut grooves into the tiles, and they're thin enough so that your heel never touches the groove. So that enabled us to have beautiful glossy glazing that will, after the rain or in the sun, will sparkle in a way that is quite unusual in a public place. And that is a dry test fit of the actual tiles. You don't really read that they're parallelograms, but this idea of taking a diagonal through it was again to increase the visual complexity, although there are only 6 tile types. And then we thought that we would try extruding porcelain for the cafe roof, and porcelain has never been extruded before, and there is a reason, because it didn't work. So this is the result of many months of testing, but we had to accept at the end of this testing period that it wasn't going to work. Maybe with more time it could work. So the tiles for the cafe roof, which are more kind of diamond shape, are also slip cast. And the glaze on them is so subtle. We have a diagonal again, and half of the tile has a glossy glaze and half is just the porcelain. But the glaze is so subtle that when they put the glaze on, they couldn't remember if they'd put it on or not. And so they had to add a chemical to it, this blue chemical, which was burnt off during the kiln so that they'd know when they'd applied the glaze before it went into the kiln. And this is a plan of the entrance hall. So you see the 3 entrances that we've cut, where we cut through the stonework. And on the floor of the V&A are really beautiful mosaics, and there's a great tradition of the borders of the mosaics. But we had to take up the mosaics in order to do the work. But we've kept them, and we've washed and cleaned them, and we've relaid them as a border to reference the pattern of the courtyard. And actually these mosaics have been done in Italy by a wonderful group of women who sing as they do it. And there you can see the border of the mosaic, and in the spaces that have no mosaic, that's where the terrazzo will be. So it's as though the edge just bleeds into, there's no hard edge, but it's a soft edge that just merges into terrazzo. And then back to the history that we had to negotiate. What was so interesting, after we'd got permission, after 9 months of negotiation, to alter the screen and open it, we then had the paradox of having to close it at night, because although this is a public place, it belongs to the V&A, it's a priceless collection, you have to secure the museum at night. And there have to be gates that withstand the impact of a terrorist attack. And yet, however you do it, with these gates have to be enduring, they have to have gravitas, and they have to be beautiful. And we looked at so many ways of doing it. We looked at using glass that electrically went into the ground, or bollards that disappeared into the ground, or conventional gates, and everything. Nothing worked for us. Nothing felt that it had this kind of enduring quality. At the same time, we had to, in order to do the work, we've had to take down the whole screen, and each stone has to be labelled, and it's taken off site, and then it's put back in its altered state, and the stones that are not being put back are there just in case one day somebody wants to. And we commissioned, in order that we could mark these stones, we commissioned a survey drawing, and when that survey drawing came back, we knew how to solve the problem, because that screen has you can see on the left that there's the shrapnel damage from World War II, and it was a very emotive part of the whole, you're taking away this very important part of history, but we're not taking away all of it. But so what we wanted to do was then, when that drawing came back, it maps the imprint of the shrapnel damage. So we wanted to find a way of mapping that, of making visible the invisible, of memorializing absence with the design of the screen. And this is a 25 mil thick piece of aluminium that we designed a piece of software. It's perforated, but all the perforations are at different angles, so that from certain vantage points it looks like now very dynamic, but now you see the imprint of the shrapnel damage. So as you walk past it, it will be made visible. And then when it's in the open position, the gates are against, the base of the columns are new because we had to obviously take them away and rebuild them, and the structure is now slightly different. But everything above the base and the pilasters either side of the main entrance are the old stones put back. And the gates fold when they're open exactly against the depth of the columns. And there again, you can read the imprint of the shrapnel damage. And this is a mock-up that we did on site just to demonstrate. And on the right, you can see that it is really quite visible, and you can understand the different angles of the perforation. And there exists an inscription on the stonework that talks about how the museum withstood the attack of the Blitz and how the enduring values of the museum are in a way represented by this shrapnel damage, and we're putting a new inscription below that speaks of what we've done and how we're memorializing it in a different way. And then this is a museum there by Royal Charter, and it wasn't part of our brief to incorporate the Royal Crest, but Mark Jones, one of the directors of the V&A, he said something that really touched me at a very early meeting. He said, it's very important that people, but particularly politicians, remember why this museum is there. And I thought, well, then let's find a way of giving a more modern reading of this rather hideous crest. And so for the centre gates, we've perforated just perpendicular through the 25mm aluminium to give you a very blown up version of the Royal Crest, which speaks of its history, but also it speaks of modernity. And here you can see how this very kind of easy way into the museum. Now, towards the end, I just want to talk about this structural challenge, because I think it's important to talk about that, particularly in Milan and in Italy. This was a very, very daring project. We've dug down 15 meters. We have piled and underpinned within 1 meter of a Grade 1 listed building. The museum remained open to the public the entire time. The collection was still there, priceless collection. So the structural challenge was immense, and what you see here are the props that are literally stopping the elevations from falling in. And I think, if we had shown the client what digging down so close to their museum meant, in reality, we would never have won the competition. It is very daring, but we've worked with Arup, who are the most extraordinary engineers. And you can see here how literally the weight of history is being held on these beams. And what is so interesting, Arup worked quite closely with Cambridge University, and Cambridge University got to hear of this project, and it is quite extreme. And so they have installed, purely as a piece of research and at their own expense, fiber optic monitoring cables into the tension piles. And the tension piles themselves go down 50 meters, because usually when you dig a big basement, you put a big superstructure on top, a high-rise, a multi-story building, but we're just putting a courtyard. So the slab just wants to float, so you have to hold it down with these massive tension piles. And Cambridge University think that the movements and uplift that will be recorded after the work has finished might actually disprove the elastic theory, which is the theory that the engineers use to calculate how to build something like this. And if that happens, we will have advanced knowledge in a way that we never imagined at the outset. But these kind of gifts happen if you really push something, if you really kind of test something to its limits. This is the new entrance hall. And again, you can see the weight of history. Now, interestingly, the columns there that you see in that kind of red oxide colour. In the animation I'll show you in a moment, originally we designed them to be white and blend in with everything else. But when I was on site and I saw, you see the kind of visceral work that these columns are doing, holding up the weight of history. I thought we have to show that, and we are painting them in a very bright red oxide paint, and the beams as well, so that you just have a sense of the work that they are doing. And this is a slightly more recent site photograph from above. And this is, the museum opens in June, and this is, I hope we'll just kind of consolidate everything that I've spoken about. So there is the altered screen with the perforated walls. You just drift in off the street into the courtyard. The cafe in the area of sun. The courtyard's actually a much more beautiful, subtle colour than this. This was done at a very early stage. That's the oculus looking down that is conceptualized as the empty museum vitrine. You see the relationship between the modernity of the design, but also the history. You come down the steps, or you can go down the ramp, and you come in through one of the 3 new entrances. There you see through right to the Majeski Garden. It's a smallish entrance hall, and then you go down the stair. There is only one stair to go down, or you go the other way and you connect into the rest of the museum. So there you see the 2 stairs passing each other by, like kind of ships in the night. There are those columns which are now very bright red oxide. And we've manipulated the light. So when you get to the bottom of the stair, there's more daylight than at the top, even though you're 12 meters below ground. And it just makes you feel more comfortable. And there's this kind of magic moment where light will come through the oculus rather than like it. So you see it was originally white. Then you've been to the exhibition, you've done your cult show, you're coming up. And this is the very glossy balustrade that will reflect the image of the Henry Colwyn. And you come up into this really lofty, light-filled space, which is the shop, which is the one bit that we're not doing. I think you'll probably see that when it's done. And then you come into the courtyard and the night view. So thank you.